Hey folks, welcome back. Time for some more Starfleet Battles chat, and today we're going to be looking at Captain's Module C5, the Magellanic Cloud. Now, in the past I've covered Module C4 and C6. All of those, much like C1, C2, and C3, added new empires to the game in various different contexts. C5 is different in that it opens up a whole new setting, essentially. So, in a way, C4 was similar in that we have the simulator setting, but the intention of that is to kind of push the game system in odd directions to challenge existing empires, whereas the Magellanic Cloud is creating a whole new setting with a bunch of new races that are fighting against each other and against the imminent invasion of the Andromedans. So that's how the Magellanic Cloud came about, basically, is that in the Starfleet universe, as you will know if you have the game up to this point, at a certain stage after the General War, in the main setting, the Alpha Octant of the Milky Way galaxy, an extragalactic invader force called the Andromedans comes over from the Andromeda galaxy. However, what may not be necessarily known to you at this time is that on their way to set up that invasion of the Milky Way, the Andromedans started by invading the Lesser Magellanic Cloud, which is one of our neighboring galaxies, closer to us than the Andromedan galaxy. So, by going into the LMC and wiping out as much as they could there, the Andromedans built an invasion base closer to the Milky Way where they could then proceed to take on us. Later on, the galaxy unites, fights back against the Andromedans, pushes them back to the LMC, and fights what's called Operation Unity, where they work together with the LMC and finish off the Andromedan invasion once for all. Now, there's a lot of that history that's not been written yet in the game, basically, so we don't know all the details of what Operation Unity looks like, although if you look at Captain's Log number 49, there's a lot of detail about the Andromedan War in the Milky Way galaxy, so go take a look at that issue if you're curious more about that part of the history. But the LMC is a really cool setting, and because it's completely free of any kind of Star Trek canon baggage, all the ideas here for systems, weapons, and the way ships work in general are really fresh and new, creating lots of interesting new tactics and exciting game situations, which is really, really fun. Particularly for long-time players of SFB. It really will have to open your mind up to new approaches to play at even the most basic level. Now, of course, you do see Andromedans on the cover here, but they don't really feature in the module. They're in the background history. But really what you'll find here is a whole bunch of new stuff. So, as you can see on the back blurb here, the LMC is an island galaxy below the plane of the Milky Way and the primary staging point of the Andromedan invasion. So what do we get in here? We get 5 new races, over a dozen new weapons and systems, and a combination of new systems, new sensors, and new weapons give the Magellanic powers a set of tactics and playstyles completely unique to Starfleet battles. Nothing you've played before has prepared you for this. There is also an extensive history of the Magellanic Cloud and all the related stuff that I was just talking about. And we get 216 counters, so a full counter sheet, 96-page rulebook, and 96-page SSD book. So a load of good content in here. I wanted to point out as well that this product was put together by Ken Burnside. He was really dedicated to this concept, and according to the designer's notes in here, he really pushed Steve Cole and ADB to put this product on the schedule and get it out. He got a lot of playtesting organized and was really instrumental in getting it put together. And he did a great job putting together something really unique and fun to play. So congrats to Ken for that. Ken later split off from the SFB world to start a new company called Ad Astra Games, which is still in business and making really exciting and innovative 3-dimensional Starship combat games, of which I own a couple, so I will talk about those in some future videos as well. So Ken Burnside, a very talented designer. So we'll start off by looking at the rulebook a little bit, so you get an idea of what's in here. And after we go through that, the counters, and talk about the ships, then I'll give you my final thoughts. So it's a big old thick rulebook, 96 pages. We get on the cover a couple of nice black outlines of some of the ships we'll be encountering in here. Now, there are a lot of new rules to get your head around in this module. So as you can see from the table of contents, we've got new elements to combat, we've got a bunch of new weapons, we've got new systems, we've got new power mechanisms, we've got new fighter and shuttle rules, we've got new mines, and then we've got all of our R-section rules. And there's a bunch of scenarios as well, which is cool. And there are also some rules to play some early years ships in the Magellanic Cloud. So the very early days of some of these empires is covered a little bit. So the module opens up with a great deal of detail on the history of the LMC. I'm not going to go into all this. Basically, I'll just kind of skip through this and I'll show you the map and talk about the basic empires that we get in here. I will say, if you go through the history and when you buy the module, you'll see that there are some players outlined in this history that are not covered in this module. So there is scope, hopefully, for a follow-up. And there has been a lot of discussion on the ADB BBS to cover more of this history. I mean, look, they really got into a lot of detail with this. Quite a few year-by-year kind of major events happening here. Then we have some details on the introduction and refit dates of ships in the Magellanic Cloud. And then we get into a really major difference between the Magellanic ships and the Alpha Octant ships, and that is the way their sensors and scanners work. So if you're familiar with SFB, you'll know that ships and bases and other craft, they have sensor and scanner tracks, and those can be damaged during the course of combat, and those reduce your ability to gain lock-ons to enemy ships and therefore target them with your weapons. Now, in an Alpha Octant ship, you have one scanner track and one sensor track that apply to the whole ship. In Magellanic ships, they actually have two separate sets of scanners and sensors, and they are dedicated to the front and rear half of the ship, respectively. Their effective arcs are a little bit wider, so the rear sensor and scanner cover an RX arc, which is like 270 degrees, and likewise the front set of scanners and sensors cover the front 270 degrees. So there is some overlap, but that means you can end up with some blind spots, and it's possible to take different amounts of damage on your sensor and scanner tracks on the different halves of your ship. And all the rules in here talk about how that works. Basically, there's a directional damage rule. So in SFB, as you will know, hopefully, if you get shot at and you take internal damage that hits a phaser, you're supposed to take that damage on phasers that are in the firing arc, or that have a firing arc bearing on where that shot came from, right? So if you get shot from the front left side of the ship, then any phaser that gets blown up should be in that area of the ship. And likewise with these sensor and scanner tracks. So if you get shot from the rear and you take sensor damage, you will mark off damage on the sensor track on the rear of the ship rather than the front. So it's fairly easy to understand. But this has a whole raft of different consequences and really changes the way you have to think about tactics and how you deal with sensor and scanner damage. It's a really interesting element of SFB that, by the way, is not represented at all in FC. And I think I had a comment on one of my previous videos mentioning that sensor and scanner damage was kind of missed by this player in FC. And I kind of agree. It's an interesting element of SFB. And here it's really expanded out into a really sort of in-depth element of tactics. So if you like the kind of sensor and damage or sensor and scanner damage aspect of SFB, then the Magellanics might really appeal to you for that reason. So the way these scanners works is explained, how it affects things like seeking weapon control. So you can pass control of your seeking weapons from one side of the ship and its scanner tracks to the other. All sorts of consequences are explored for that. Then we have the other huge difference. Okay, so a typical ship in the Alpha Octant will have 6 directional shields, one mapping to each hex side in which the ship is sitting on the board, right? Here in the Magellanic Cloud, ships have those 6 shields, but they also have 2 more shields within that outer layer of 6 shields. So they effectively have 8 shields. The 2 inner shields are covering one half of the ship. So you have a front half inner shield and a back half inner shield. And this really, again, creates a whole new dynamic. And it also opens up design space for some cool new weapons in this product that specifically affect kind of the outer and inner shield dynamic. Now, in order to make things work well with this new structure and to create some interest tactically, what happens with Magellanic ships is their outer shields have what's called a volley reduction factor. So when you take damage on a shield, on an outer shield in a Magellanic ship, that incoming volley of damage is automatically reduced by a certain amount, which, there's various details here, but basically, if you total up the amount of power in that shield, divide it by half, then that will be the amount you reduce the incoming damage. Okay, so it kind of works that way. So they give a bunch of examples here to make it a lot easier, and also for more complicated cases like where you're using hellbores and these kind of enveloping weapons that affect more than one shield. But the basic idea is that the outer shield significantly reduce the amount of incoming damage and help provide a cushion before you get through to the inner shields, which do not have a volley reduction factor. Okay, So you have these two different layers of outer defenses that behave a bit differently. Also, other aspects of shield play, like reinforcement, work differently in the LMC than they do in the Alpha Octant. Again, I'm not going to get too into that, but it's really, really cool. You'll see all of that on the SSDs when we get to looking at specific ships. But the multi-layer shields and the split apart sensor and scanner damage tracks really change up the tactics in the Magellanic Cloud. When you combine that with a dozen different weapons and new systems, lots of cool stuff to explore. Plays very differently from what you might expect. So we have lots of rules about how these shields work, how to repair them, how to deal with reinforcement and damage, how much they cost to maintain. Now, you do have to drop both layers of shields if you want to do things like transport things, and all of that and the other kind of interactions with other systems are outlined here. So it's all pretty clear how it works. Then there's some rules here for the target acquisition gear, which is a system used by the Uthiki Harmony. And basically this allows better quality of lock-on for the Uthiki weapons. So not something we really need to get into too much. Then we have a handy weapons table for everything you will find in this product, which also has some little clarifying notes, including the cost of each weapon to fire, which is actually really helpful, especially if you're just trying to get to grips with all this new stuff. But we'll get to each of the weapons individually here in a few minutes. And in fact, we will do so right now with the warp-tuned laser. So big difference in the weapon loadout for Magellanic ships is that instead of phasers, they use warp-tuned lasers. So these are lasers that are fired through a kind of warp tunnel and accelerated to faster than light speed so that they can hit ships traveling at tactical warp speeds. Effectively, they work a lot like phasers, but what is different is, of course, the damage tables are different. We have light, early, medium, and heavy warp-tuned lasers with different damage values and ranges than with phasers in the Alpha Octant, but also they use capacitors differently. So in the Alpha Octant, you have phaser capacitors that allow you to store power in advance to fire through your phasers. Here you have a similar thing, but those capacitors are actually capacitance banks, which are physically located on the SSD and can be destroyed. So that changes up the dynamic a little bit. So we got some details here about the phaser, or the warp-tuned lasers and how they work. Then mass drivers, these are also really interesting. So these are kind of a combination between seeking weapons and direct fire weapons. If you remember in C4, the hyperdrones, it's a little bit similar to that. So the mass driver is basically a way to use warp coils to chuck a missile at an opposing ship at a really high speed. And at the last possible second before impact, it slows down for some last second targeting to try and get its precision right and impacts the target. And there's a bunch of different types of mass drivers. And effectively what you do when you fire a mass driver, which is all described here, it's kind of a unique weapon sequence here, so it has to be explained, and there's plenty of examples. Basically, you declare you're going to fire your salvo of mass driver missiles, and then you must designate a flight path in the straightest possible path to your target. And then basically along that flight path 2 hexes before impact, that's called the terminal approach hex, and you'll put your mass drivers there, and your target will have a chance to shoot them down before impact. So they kind of warp across the board instantly until they get right up on the doorstep of impact. Then you have a defensive fire opportunity, and if that fails, then they will slam into your opponent. And there's lots of cool stuff you can do with these. They are very different in practice than drones, but they are also customizable like drones. And that's all outlined in here, ME 2.4, the missile construction rules. And there are some key basic types here. So you have the anti-ship missile, you have the anti-fighter missile. So the anti-ship missile is a key type that you'll use very often. So it can take 3 points of damage before it's destroyed. It does 5 damage to any target. The anti-fighter missile also takes 3 hits to destroy, but it does 8 points of damage to small targets of size class 6 and 2 damage to everything else. So it's really good against fighters and not much else. Then you have the charge penetrator missile here, the CPM. So this is designed to punch through layers of shields. So it'll do 1 damage to the outer shields and either 2 internal damage if there's no further shields, or 2 damage to the internal shields. Then you have kinetic slug missiles, which are more heavily armored, but they do less damage. Then you have these ground bombardment missiles, which don't damage anything in space, but they are effectively transporter artillery to launch at planets for ground assault assistance. And then finally, you have the early standard missile. So early year ships use this. It's basically an anti-ship missile, but it does less damage. So lots of ships have mass drivers in different configurations. They also can be used on fighters. But one interesting characteristic of the Magellanic Cloud is that there are not very many fighters. The Magadim Empire uses them, and really there's not many others around. So there's a lot less seeking weapons on the board because you're using stuff like mass drivers that impact really quickly and don't fly around the board like drones do. And you have a lot less fighters, which typically are delivering lots of drones on the board in SFB, but not so in the LMC. So it helps speed up the game a little bit. And if you're not really into fighters and drones, then the LMC might be for you. All right, then we have lots of interactions between the mass drivers and many other systems, including from the Omega modules, which I'll get to in a future video, mines, cloaks, blah, 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 terrain. Then we have a new heavy weapon here. This is the charged particle accelerators. These are used by an empire called the Badovai. And this is basically a huge particle accelerator. It takes up more than one spot on the SSD, so it takes several hits to fully destroy. And you can pump a lot of energy into this thing over 3 turns, up to 9 power in total, so you can see on the combat table over here. So if you pump it up to maximum power and then unleash it at range 0, you'll do 24 damage, which is quite a bit. So the range and the amount of energy you put in over 3 turns is what determines the damage. And it has, a decent range going out to 27 hexes, although it would be a lot of power investment to get a decent amount of damage at that distance. But they're a pretty cool heavy weapon, and the Badovai in general are kind of the most Alpha Octant-like of the empires in this galaxy. So if you want to ease your way into using these guys, that would be a good place to start. The weapons are all fairly straightforward to understand. Now we have another weapon used by a different empire called the Inine, and this is the variable focus neutron beam. This is a cool one. So this is a heavy beam weapon that has 2 firing modes. In one mode, you use what's called a wide aperture, so you make the beam wider. Basically, it means it's much easier to hit and do damage, but the damage is lessened. Alternatively, you can do a narrow aperture, where you then have to do a 2-hit roll, but the damage overall is higher. So if you look at the tables here, with the narrow aperture, we can't hit anybody at range 0, right, with the wide aperture. And then at range 1 to 2, we can do 12 damage or 8 damage, depending on the roll. At range 3 to 6, we might get lucky and do 12, but more likely we'll do 8, or if we're unlucky, 4, and so on and so forth. There's variability here in the damage that we do. Whereas with the narrow aperture, assuming that we get the hit roll, then we're going to do basically the maximum damage in those range brackets, guaranteed. So there's a risk of missing completely, but if you do hit, you will get more damage done. So that's the trade-off that you can make. But it's cool to have a weapon like that where you have these pretty different firing modes. Depending on the amount of risk you need to put into that situation tactically, you may choose to fire your neutron beams in different ways. Then we have my personal favorite of the new weapon, which is the Tachyon Beam. So this is used by the Magadim hives, the insectoid people who use fighters as well in this galaxy setting. So the Tachyon Beam is a unique weapon that basically, the idea is it encases the target in a bubble of some kind of energy, and then it punctures that bubble with a Tachyon Beam. And the 2 points of contact of that puncturing beam are the facing shield and the shield on the exact opposite side of the ship. And so basically, energy flares up at those 2 points, and if you roll well on the table, you will do damage to both the facing shield of the opponent and the shield on the immediate opposite side of the ship, which is really cool. The table looks a little bit confusing, but it's easy enough to use. So basically, let's say I'm at range 0. I'll roll 2 dice, and if I get lower than 11, then that means the first wodge of damage here will hit, assuming I've overloaded it, of course, will hit the facing shield. If my roll is also lower than 9, then the damage to the rear shield on the other side will also hit. So it's possible to hit with both, or to hit with just one, depending on what happens with your rolls. It's a really cool weapon, and I like these weapons that kind of mix up the standard maneuvering tactics. It's like the Hydra and Hellbores. They hit the weakest shield no matter where you're pointed. So you really have to keep track of what you're doing with your shield reinforcement and your overall effectiveness is changed by, having to change the way you spend energy and the way you maneuver your ship in response to potentially your opponent being able to damage a weak shield, even though you're not pointing it towards them. And I really like that kind of interesting dynamic. So it's a fun and unique weapon to use. And it can be overloaded, as you could see. And then we have another cool one. This is the positron lancet. This is used by the Uthiki Harmony. And this is another weapon that has multiple firing modes. So you can see there's a damage table here. So it can be overloaded. It has highly variable damage because it involves a d6 roll plus a bonus. If you overload, you add 6 to your roll. And if it's a standard shot, you only add 2. And there's a 2-hit roll as well. So there's 2 different modes. There's standard mode and lancet mode. If you fire in standard mode, it's just normal damage, right? If you're firing a bunch of positron lancets or firing them with other weapons, you get some more damage added to your volley as per usual, and it's applied in the normal way. If you're firing in lancet mode, then something a little bit different happens. So you have a new damage allocation method. So this applies if you manage to fire a positron lancet in lancet mode through a down shield. Then you just roll 1 time on the damage allocation table, and you kind of move along that line of the deck, treating every entry along that row as just 1 hit. So basically the idea is that this is a shot that punctures through the ship and damages a whole lot of systems. It gets really deep down in the damage allocation table, even if you just get 1 shot through to internal damage. So it's pretty scary, and you can end up losing some pretty vital stuff, unfortunately early in the battle, and then really have to adjust how you deal with it. So it's a pretty cool weapon. Then another Uthiki weapon, we have the Boson Drill. So I really like this one as well, because this is a weapon that is clearly inspired by the double-layered shields that are used by the Magellanics. So this is a weapon of 2 parts. It has a drill bit, and then it has kind of an explosive charge underneath that. So it has 2 layers of damage that it does. There's different ways that you can load it and hold it, which I won't get into. But basically, here's your Boson Drill combat table, and you can see that there's 2 damage numbers here. The leftmost number is the damage that's done to the shields, and like a shield cracker for a Celtorian, this is only shield damage, doesn't ever transfer to internal damage. And then in the brackets, you have the damage that occurs to the layer below the outer shield. So if I were to fire a Boson Drill at a Magellanic ship that has both layers of shields up, it would do 6 damage to the outer shield and then puncture through and do 2 damage to the inner shield straight away. And the outer shield damage is not reduced by the volley reduction factor, which is a major deal. You can also, of course, use this weapon with non-Magellanic ships, and what would happen then is the outer damage would apply to any outer shields, and the inner damage number here would be applied to internal systems. And likewise, if you fire at a Magellanic and their inner shields are down or whatever, then you can get internal damage as well. So it's really specialized at punching through those outer layers of defense and trying to dig through, get rid of those inner shields more quickly, which is really cool and quite scary for the opponent. Then we have one of our few sort of seeking weapon options in the Magellanic Cloud. That's the Type E Plasma Torpedo. So it's a Plasma E. Basically, it functions just like a plasma torpedo as we know and love them. But you can see there's only one type that's used in the Magellanic Cloud. And it's just basically between a Plasma F, and like a Plasma D and a Plasma F, I suppose. So it has a short range. It burns out after just 15 hexes of travel. And it starts with 15 damage and goes down to 1 at the very end. It can be bolted, but there's none of all the fancy additional arming and firing methods that you have with plasma in the Alpha Octant. So you don't have envelopers, you don't have shotguns, you don't have fast-loading F torpedoes or anything. You can do plasma bolts with these. They have only 2 points of built-in electronic countermeasures, which is different, again, from plasma torpedoes in Alpha, which have 3. So there's a few differences here summarized in this handy paragraph. But effectively, it's a typical plasma torpedo, just with not that much damage and a relatively short range. But it's good to have that familiar tactical thing to hang your hat on if you're used to the plasma races. Now we're getting into new systems. So this is the distortion field generator used by the Jumokian Resistance. So it's kind of similar to a cloaking device, but it's not quite as effective in some ways. However, it does still have a similar effect in one aspect, in that it basically extends the range to your ship if your opponents are firing on you. The difference is that the amount of penalty hexes, as they refer to it, is set by the amount of energy that you put into the device, right? Also, unlike a cloak, you can fire weapons while you're using the distortion field generator, but it will void your protection for a period of time. So it's pretty cool to have a different option. You can't use both a DFG and a cloak at the same time, of course. But it's interesting to have a different variation of the cloaking device. It's a little bit more straightforward in some ways, but it still can help you when you're in a pinch. Then we have high-powered reactors for the Anine. Basically, this is a kind of benefit for Anine ships where they can have some reactors that provide additional power. Then we have capacitance banks, which I already talked about. These are the capacitor systems for managing power to weapon systems in the LMC. So they work differently from the capacitors we're used to in the Alpha Octant. Then we have shuttle and fighter operations. So as I mentioned, we don't really have much in the way of fighters in the Magellanic Cloud. But there are rules here for how to deal with loading mass driver missiles, lasers, Type E plasmas, etc. on fighters. And it outlines exactly what sort of shuttles are available in the Magellanic Cloud. Basically, the only real fighters you're going to be dealing with are just from the Magadim, and I believe there are plasma assault boats as well from the Anine. The Magellanic Overdrive is pretty cool. So if you're used to fighters in Alpha, this is a pretty neat addition. Basically, fighters in the Magellanic Cloud have an additional method of getting a boost of movement. So as I'll show you on the SSDs how it's written, they have an extra number in their speed, which indicates how many extra hexes of movement they can get by turning on overdrive. And so effectively, when they turn on overdrive, they'll get that number of extra hexes each subsequent impulse, right? So if you have a +8 on your speed, then you will get 8 impulses of double hexes of movement. And that allows you to get out of trouble really quickly. So a good way to use your fighters in the Magellanic Cloud, if you're using, say, Wasp fighters for the Magadim, is to pump out your mass drivers, do as much damage as you can, turn off, punch the overdrive to try and make it back to your carrier and reload. So they're a really good way of getting out of dodge, basically. Once you use the overdrive, you can't use it again for 32 impulses, so you really do want to time it well as well. Then we have a Magellanic specific energy allocation form, which is helpful. Then we have a description of the new types of captor mines that are available. I'm not big on mine warfare, so I won't go into that. And then we get into the unit descriptions. Not much exciting to show on camera here because there's not really any diagrams or anything. But there is, here we go, there's a diagram of the different factions in the Magellanic Cloud. C is the Chomak community, which you'll find in the history, but they're not really represented in this product. We have the Jamokian homeworld, which is in Anine space here, and this is the Anine Empire. We have the Magadine hives. We have the Badavai Imperium. We have the Uthiki Harmony, the Erol Septs, and Neutral World. So there are a few elements here that aren't yet covered by the Magellanic ships that we have, but they should be covered, hopefully, in subsequent modules, which are definitely under discussion by the fans. Then we get into some designer's notes, then we have our annexes, master ship charts, and the usual things you'd expect in a module for SFB. All right. Then we'll take a look at the counters. So we get a full sheet of counters. These are in the old styles. You can see they haven't been updated with the newer style. So we get 216 counters instead of 280. And I won't go into the details here. You can recognize the ship designations. They're the same that we would use in Alpha. So you can see there's some frigates, cruisers, destroyers, we've got some dreadnoughts and stuff, and some shuttles. These are for the Jamokian pirates. We have some general units that can be used by all the empires. Then we have a bunch of guys here for the Magadim hives. You can see they do have a very bug-like appearance as well. We got a bunch of those, including a number of fighter counters, because they're very frequent users of fighters. Then we have just a few ships representing the Uthiki Harmony. We've got a cruiser, we've got destroyer, a defensive satellite installation, and some frigates. Then we've got the Anine, who have quite a large array of ships here as well. cruisers, destroyers, and various types of, yeah, we've got all kinds of specialized roles here as well. A number of shuttles and a few fighters. Then we have the Badovai Imperium. And these also include some PFs, which are unique to the Badovai in this setting. And a number of shuttles, and we have some base stations as well for scenario purposes or defending fixed installations. So you can see that there are 5 empires effectively in the product. We have the Uthiki, the Drumokians, the Magadim, the Anin, and the Badovai, but the Magadim, Anin, and Badovai are by far the most represented here. We have kind of 3 main empires tussling with each other while they get messed around by the Drumokians, who are kind of the local equivalent of the Orion pirates, and the Uthiki sort of hanging around in the background. It was kind of an interesting dynamic there. Then we have a huge SSD book of 96 pages. I'm not going to go into everything here. I'll just try and pick a few kind of representative examples. You can see from the table of contents, we've got a load of good stuff in here. We have, first 10 pages are general units. So we have the pinnaces are kind of workboats and civilian PFs and stuff. And we have tugs, base stations, and outposts. Then for the Badovai, we have a good selection of ships, about 20 or so. Well, more than that. Yeah, about 25. Another good selection here for the Anins and the Magadim. Then we just have 6 for the Uthiki and 4 Drumokian pirate hulls as well. So we'll pick a couple out of each of those options there. So as far as the general units, something unique you'll find is the Asteroid Shipyard. It's a shipyard based on an asteroid, as you might expect. And here's our first instance of seeing a bank square on the SSD. So this is a capacitance bank that's used to power the weapons that I described before. And then we have some medium lasers here. You can see the table down there, which is kind of the local equivalent of the Phaser 2, effectively. And we have some light lasers as well, and a ship construction bay. And as with like a Jandarian ship, this, of course, is using armor belts because it's a big old rock, but also it does have inner shields as well because it is a Magellanic structure. And you can see here also that we have sensor and scanner tracks for the front and the rear of the ship, as I was describing to you before. Then we'll get into some Badovai stuff. So here is a strike cruiser. This one has some PF mech links here. You need a refit for that, which is another 7 points, but you can stuff some Badovai PFs on there, which is pretty cool. You can see there's 2 charged particle accelerators here, CPA2s. They take up 2 spots in the SSD, so they need to be hit twice to be destroyed. Then they've got 4 forward-facing mass driver launchers, which is pretty cool. And then we have an array of medium lasers in the center here and at the front. And then we have a larger 3-space CPA in the back as well, and some light lasers for defense against drones and so forth. It's a pretty well-rounded ship. And with the refit as well, you can bring some PFs into battle as a force multiplier, which is pretty cool. And you can see here more clearly, now we've got these outer 6 shields, right? The inner shields are clearly marked as such. So we have an inner shield on the FH arc, which is this front hemisphere, and the inner shield RH, which is this back hemisphere. So once you punch through these outer 6 shields, you will start doing damage to the inner shields until those are eventually busted down as well. And again, we have our sensor and scanner tracks both to the front and to the rear, which can be affected differently depending on where your hits are landing when you damage those tracks. And let's see, we can look at something else like a destroyer. So it's a much more compact ship here, just 88 points. You can see we still have 3 mass drivers here in the front with the tracks here to match. I've got a probe launcher as well. We've got a 360-degree medium laser and a couple of bank spaces. And then we do have a couple of mech links as well. So assuming we pay for the refit, we could carry a couple of PFs on there as well. We got some light lasers for defense. So pretty much what you would expect from a lighter ship of this type. You can see they still have pretty strong inner shields. Generally, I think the inner shields max out at 20 points on each of those 2 axes. So the outer shields here are not so hot, but you still have a decent protection from those inner shields. And of course, the outer shields have that Magellanic specific volley reduction factor. Maybe we'll skip through here and look for the PFs, which are a unique element of the Bodivai. And you can see there's lots of cool stuff in here, war cruisers and bases. Here are some interceptors, so of course the predecessors to the PFs. And these guys, you'll note they only have the inner shields. They don't have the 6 outer shields. And they just have the sensor tracks here as well. And because these are kind of early PF versions, they don't have much in the way of warp power, as you can see. Not a lot going on there. Just 2 mass drivers and a medium laser and a couple of small light lasers. So not a whole lot of firepower, but they are cheap at 15 points. Then we get to the PFs, which are significantly improved. You can see they still have just the inner shields. They don't have the outer shield, so there's no volley reduction factor for you. And they have more, looks like they have more mass drivers as well. And we have, again, a medium laser and a couple of light lasers. And then we have additional warp power, which gives them a little more ability to shoot around the board and cause trouble, which is always a good thing. All right, now we're getting to the Anine. So let's take a look here at the heavy cruiser, which just has a comparison to the Bodivai heavy cruiser we saw before. Once again, we've got our standard Magellanic inner shields, relatively small outer shields. We've got our scanner and sensor tracks for both halves of the ship. We've got a couple of shuttle spaces here, which can carry the PAS fighter. So these guys, they move at speed 15 plus 4, as you can see. So the plus 4 means that it can use Magellanic overdrive for 4 impulses. And for those 4 impulses, it'll get an extra hex of movement each impulse when it needs to get out of dodge. They're fairly lightly armed, just 1 light laser with a 360-degree firing arc. And then they have a heavy weapon charge as well. And they only can take a relatively small amount of damage, so 7 damage will cripple these guys. But nevertheless, it's useful to have some attrition units to draw fire away from your opponent, which is, again, not that common in the Magellanic Cloud, so useful when you have attrition units available to take some heat off of the main ships. And again, the Anine, they fire neutron beams, so they have the wide and narrow firing modes that we talked about, as well as an array of medium and light lasers, and these guys can also use the Type E plasma, so they do have a little bit of seeking weapon capability as well. All right, we'll skip ahead a bit, see what else we can show you. There's a monitor, we've got a scout corvette, survey corvette, minesweeper. How about a new light cruiser? So this guy's light cruiser at 114 points. Again, pretty decent inner shields here. And we're carrying PAS fighters once more. We have 3 banks here in the middle. We've got 2 plasma E launchers, which is useful, and a couple of sets of neutron beams, one on the left, one on the right. And once again, we have just the 2 shuttle spaces. Seems like a decent amount of warp power here for a ship of this size. So I think it's a pretty interesting mix of weapons on the Anine. I think these guys are fun to fight with, given that you have a little bit of fighter power to use, but you've also got the plasma E's to influence enemy movement, and you have the flexibility of the neutron beams being either narrow or wide firing, so that's pretty cool as well. So the Anine are fun, and if you like using fighters in SFB, you can get a little taste of that with these guys, but really you should probably use the Magellanic if you really love fighters. All right, we got frigates, commando frigates, minesweepers, then we have a mobile base here on the top and a base station. Then we have planetary defense. Now we're getting into the Magellanic. So I'll skip ahead to one of their carriers here. Let's try the assault carrier right here. So now we're getting into a familiar sight for those of you who watched my discussions about fighters before. Here's an assault carrier. And we have a couple of squadrons of Magellanic fighters here. You can see there is a bunch of shuttle spaces available here on both the kind of thorax of the ship and the right and left sides. We've also got some Tachyon beams, some medium lasers up front, and we've got some option mounts as well, which can be either twin lasers or medium lasers, which is noted here under the option boxes. And then we have our banks and a few more medium lasers to the rear to fend off any drones. So these guys, there's a few different types of fighters that the Magellanic use with different speeds and capabilities. The Wasps are pretty good because you've got 2 light lasers with a 360-degree arc. You have a bunch of mass driver charges, and then you've got speed 15 plus 8, which means they're really nimble. They move at standard speed of 15, and then if you need to get out of dodge, you can have 8 impulses of overdrive, which is really cool. They can't carry any sort of additional packs and stuff, but they are really useful little guys. The Chiggers are not quite so good because they have a lower normal speed of 12, but they do still have 8 impulses of overdrive. The Bumblebees as well are good because you have, again, 8 impulses of overdrive, and yeah, they can take along these 2 light lasers with them as well. So if you want fighters, the Magadim hives are the ones that you want to use. They tend to use smaller ships and more fighters is their way of going forward. And they use my other favorite weapon in this product, which is the Tachyon Beam, which has that cool effect of piercing through a ship and damaging the facing shield and the shield on the opposite side of the ship as well, which is really fun. Other than that, you've mostly got just medium and light lasers on this guy. Here we have a tug, so just to show you that there are some utilitarian ships in this product as well, and so that you can see the Magadim also use mass drivers. It's a fairly widespread weapon in this galaxy. And here we have a cruiser. Again, we have a couple of Tachyon beams to the front, medium lasers, and then we've got 4 mass drivers altogether, and then we have these optional mounts again, which we can choose to be twin light lasers for more defensive purposes, or medium lasers for a little bit more offense. Then we have light carriers, and we have light cruisers. So a nice array of ships for these guys. Heavy destroyers, scout carriers, heavy destroyer scouts with special sensors, heavy escort destroyers, and hybrid carriers, destroyers, survey ships. And you can see in general there's a lot more fighters appearing on these SSDs because that's pretty much the defining characteristic of this empire. Then we got commando frigates, minesweepers. We're getting into more specialized roles here. Then we have a mobile base, which also carries a complement of fighters if you have the fighter refit applied to it. And the Magadim base station, which is a more robust defensive installation with 16 fighters if you get the fighter refit for this guy. And it's got an interesting shape to it as well. Then we have Magadim Starbase. Very cool. I love these 2-page Starbase SSDs. It just looks gigantic. You can see it can be 1,200 points here. We have an absolute mess of crew units, just loads and loads of them. Then we have 12 mass drivers. We've got a bunch of fighters scattered around. And then we've got, a lot of firepower, basically. So if you're doing a big set-piece battle to take down a Magadim Starbase, I think that'd be a lot of fun to play. All right, then we have mass driver ground installations, ground-based fighter hangars, and some freighters. And now we're going to get into the fringe elements of the galaxy here. So we have the Uthiki, and here finally we get to see the Boson Drill. So there's a couple of these mounted on the Uthiki frigate. You'll remember these were designed to punch through outer shields to hit the inners without being subject to volley reduction factor, which makes them quite scary. And they have the Lancet as well. So once you take those shields down, they can punch through quite a lot of important systems in a single blast. And of course, they have the typical capacitance banks and various lasers as well. And we also have an Uthiki destroyer, a war cruiser, which is actually, it looks like a stolen Botavai ship, as you can see. And again, we can keep track of our boson drills here. We've got some light lasers, medium lasers, and positron lancets as well. And then we have an Uthiki defense platform. So this is 106 points, and you can see it's got fairly light outer shields, but it does have the full-sized inner shields. And then we do have boson drills coming out of it, a couple of special sensors as well. And then finally we have the Jumokian Pirates. So these guys, again, we have optional weapon mounts like with the Orion, so they're running about stealing stuff from other people. The pirate frigate is not super threatening in terms of its outer defenses. You can see it's only got 4 shield boxes here. But depending on the weapon's loadout, it could be more threatening than you expect. Then we have a bit beefier one here, the Destroyer. So this one has early and light lasers and medium lasers, so a mix of weapons cobbled together from other craft, and then you have your optional weapons as well. Then we have a pirate light cruiser with kind of triple hull design. We've got more medium lasers on this one, so a bit more offensive firepower. And then we have the Pirate New Destroyer, the last ship in the product. 85 points. We've got 3 option mounts to the front and a few banks, and then a bunch of medium lasers. So that's a very quick look at some of the product, or some of the ships that you can get in Module C5. And I think hopefully you can see it's a really unique setup for playing SFB. There's lots of unique new systems in here, new weapons to play with. It's really all well designed and well thought out. All the different systems interact in interesting ways. And you've got these new dynamics that are generated by the separate scanner and sensor tracks on the 2 halves of the ship, and the inner and outer shields, which don't exist, obviously, in the standard SFB Galaxy. And if you're interested in the SFU history, then it is pretty interesting to look through that extensive background of the Andromedans building their way up to an invasion of the Milky Way galaxy, and using the Magellanic Cloud as kind of their stepping stone to invade the empires which we know and love, like the Federation and everybody else. So what's the verdict? I think it's a really great product. There's a lot of great ideas in here. The only downside is that with something like C4, C6, this kind of product really doesn't come into its own unless you have a decent amount of experience with SFB. I would recommend that you familiarize yourself with the Alpha Octant style of play first. I mean, in theory, you could buy the Master Rulebook, buy this guy, and jump right into using Magellanics. But because a lot of the things outlined here, are interesting tactical changes to the base system, those won't really shine for you unless you understand how the original systems work, and it won't be as interesting in that respect. And also, the history won't make as much sense or be as fascinating if you're not familiar with the SFU background that appears in the Alpha Octant. So, first of all, I would recommend that you stick with the Alpha Octant setting to begin with. From there, you have so many options to expand that area of space, including things like Module C6 and C4 and so on. But then when you think you want to know more about what's going on in other parts of the SFU world, or if you really want to mix up your tactical experience or have a really fresh campaign with a totally new style of play, then definitely look into the LMC. It's really well put together by Ken Burnside and the various other members of the team that helped put this together. Everything's been play tested really well. One thing you will note is that there is some errata for this, but most of the big rules and everything, you don't require a lot of messing around to get things to work well. I found that in the digital version of the product, the errata are included in the PDF rulebook. Otherwise, you can find those on the ADB website. I have not double checked because, again, this is a brand new fresh copy that I just bought to replace a copy of this that I lost years ago. But one thing I will do is to check to see whether those errata have been applied to the print product or not. I'm not entirely sure if that's the case. I know that recently ADB has adopted a policy of catching as many errors as they can from playtesters in a sort of early release of the PDF product, and then not printing the physical product until they've had all the after-action reports back and they fixed as many problems as they could find. So hopefully they're sort of applying that retrospectively to older products as well, and at least putting digital products out there with more of the updates done. I'm pretty sure that they have been doing that, or at least have talked about doing that. But yeah, just be aware there are some errata for this. But given the amount of design work that went into this and the scale and ambition of it, we've got 5 new empires, we've got a dozen new systems, we've got all these new styles of play that had to be investigated and play tested to within an inch of their life. They really did a great job with it. And this also helped, I think, springboard Ken Burnside into doing more design work of his own, and has produced several other interesting games as a result. So that's a win for all of us who enjoy blowing up starships on the tabletop. So yeah, if you're into SFB, you want a new tactical challenge, you want to experience some new empires, weapons, and systems, you can't go wrong with C5. I do recommend it. I will in the future talk about Omega. Now, the Omega sector is a much bigger set of products. There's 5 Omega modules, and there's probably a number of additional ones that could be published in the future if ADB gets their act together on that front. And I will talk about Omega further down the line, which is also filled with really interesting ideas. But I like the LMC as it's kind of relatively self-contained within this single product, you have enough to keep you going for quite a while. I do hope they'll come out with an add-on and fill in some of the gaps in the history and some of the empires that we don't have much info about in this product, and hopefully that will still happen. But even if it doesn't, there's lots of great stuff to enjoy in here, and I really like the combat dynamics introduced by the layered shields and the separated scanner and sensor tracks. So that's C5. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you have any more questions about it, I'll try to answer them for you as quick as I can. And like I said, I will cover the other kind of extended settings and other galaxies for SFB. I don't have quite everything reaccumulated in my collection yet, so it will take me a little while to cover everything. And Omega is huge, so it'll probably take me a number of videos to cover all the products for that. But I think where SFB can really spread its wings a little bit is in these alternative settings, because it's not tied to any preconceptions about how Star Trek races behave. So there's familiarity in how things function in LMC and Omega, but lots of new ideas can take wing and really change the style of play. And because they don't have to face off against the Federation or the Klingons necessarily, it means they can get really creative with stuff. And much like C4, I really enjoy when a game system of this kind of complexity and depth is allowed to sort of stretch its legs and really show some creativity. So C5 is great for that. Anyway, let me know what you think. If you have the module, or if you're thinking about getting it, I look forward to seeing you in the comments, and I hope you'll stick around for future SFB videos. In the meantime, I hope you're all taking care of yourselves, staying healthy, happy, and well, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. All right, take care, and bye-bye.